Welcome to Spiral We Radio, where we explore the spiral paths of learning, parenting, and teaching through connection. Today, we joined by Laura Schonberg, an educator whose journey has taken her from alternative schools to principalships and now into district leadership in Washington state. Laura brings a unique perspective shaped by her background in psychology, special education, and administration. Her stories remind us that safety, empathy, and adaptability are at the heart of real learning. We are excited to dive in with her to talk about how the spiral adaptive lens shows up in classrooms, in leadership, and in the lives of learners who don't always fit the mold. Here are Dr. Arnstein and Dr. Gelston with Laura Schonberg.
Hi, Laura. How are you? We are so happy that you could join us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's we're in the second week of the start of school, and I'm always very thankful when school actually starts because the lead up is a lot. So no, it's good. Happy back to school of 2025.
And before Karen gets too deep, I'd like to welcome you too. It's great to have you
Thank
here.
you.
We're really excited to have you here. One of our goals, too, is to really hear the voices of teachers and coordinators and, how did they approach issues that they see in their schools and in their buildings. So we're so excited to have you here. Can you tell us a little bit more about your journey into education? How did you
Absolutely.
find your way and what has shaped your perspective?
Thank you. So I started college pre-med and thought for sure that I was actually going to work like overseas as a doctor. And so I was doing like practicum hours. I was at the University of Washington in Seattle in a physical therapy department and so young. I mean, I knew nothing. And so I was working at this very urban elementary school. And once they started trusting me a little bit, I was following students into their primary grade classrooms. So primarily first, second, and third grades. And literally the first day I walked into an elementary classroom to support this young learner, I was like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. So I ended up finishing my undergrad degree in abnormal development in psychology, stayed a fifth year. So at the University of Washington, they don't do minors, but essentially I stayed a fifth year and got minors in English and special education, and then went straight into doing my master's degree in secondary education. So, and actually during all those years, I was working at a hospital in Seattle and loved the work. I love medicine and science. I can get pretty geeky about it. I actually do all of my own animals shots and anything I can do at home to do with medicine, I do with them, poor things. And so started teaching actually in alternative education. So I did my student teaching in the Seattle public schools. And then immediately from there, while I was in graduate school, I was working at a facility in Seattle for homeless and street affiliated youth. In Washington state, it is illegal to harbor a runaway. So we never
Wow.
called runaways. They were street affiliated. So worked in kind of a reintegration program to either get kids back into public school and into services, but we were also an accredited education program. That varied wildly with what we taught and to whom and when. But, I was working with teenagers that had really never learned to read. And predominantly these were kids that had undiagnosed learning disabilities and or tremendous trauma and or had been very transient in and amongst their elementary and middle school years. A lot of very vulnerable young people. So we served youth up to ages 21 in that program. And then from there, I started teaching in alternative programs. And so I actually was one of the staff that started an alternative school in the Stanwood School District. And so I was there for 7 years and after teaching in Seattle. And then from there, moved to the Anacortes School District and again started and perpetuated ninth grade alternative programs. So kids that were specifically coming up from eighth grade into the high school that had IEPs, but also had students that had been identified as at risk and entering their ninth grade year. So on their schedule, I was their English language arts teacher, but in reality, it was kind of this like adaptive resource room. So I was carrying and developing IEPs, but then also students, again, that were very vulnerable for a variety of reasons, were high risk for dropping out. I was their primary contact at the school. And I'm actually still in touch with some of those kids, which I think is amazing. And then while I was in Anacortes, I did my administrative internship and got my master's in PK 12 school administration and went on to be a school principal first at a elementary school. It's really interesting too, because like here in Mount Vernon in my current district, like all of our elementary principals have assistants, but I was responsible for an elementary school of almost 750 kids. And then all the staff that goes along
Wow.
with it as a soloist. So that was kind of a lot. But really, I'm a secondary person at heart. So I ended up moving. No, excuse me. I need to back up. My first admin job was as an assistant principal in an area in like northeastern Whatcom County. And like there's one of the schools, like there's no cell service out there. It's like when the buses went out, it's towards Mount Baker and the Cascades and very remote community in our state, high Slavic population. Anyway, I was an assistant principal up in the Mount Baker School District for 3 years and did our accreditation and actually got to work and ended up being like a coach with other districts to do their accreditation. Fascinating process. I diverge. And so then went from Baker to Oak Harbor. So there's a naval air station in Oak Harbor. So a very mobile population with kids literally from all over the world. So I was a K-5 principal, and then I was a middle school principal in that district. And then now I'm in Mount Vernon as a program director in teaching and learning. So I'm a certificated teacher. I'm not an administrator, but I run a budget. I do some evaluations. I oversee staff and programming. Then I also have direct contact with students for highly capable and advanced.
You have done everything.
It's a little
Everything.
wild.
I
Most
mean,
people don't do that.
no,
So,
or do secondary and elementary and middle.
Right.
well, that's my question for you, Laura, is because you've had such a varied background from health to special education, having an education in special education, working in alternative education, and you've done adaptive education. And how did all of those different things affect how you view the learner? And how did that make it so that you can make sense out of them when they're struggling?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, particularly because of my upbringing, and I really struggled as a child for multiple reasons, and particularly working with well, actually, I guess it started pretty early in my career. So very early on, I was introduced to this is a person. They're not just like a kid in your classroom. And the abnormal psych background was also really beneficial that, people learn or don't learn. We could say for lots of different reasons, but generally speaking, if you are not safe, you can and will not learn. And you're not going to come to school regularly. If you do come to school, you're probably going to be tired. And if you're tired, you're not learning. But if you're very vulnerable, again, you're likely not participating very actively or positively in school. So there's the super extreme where kids are unsafe to be at school because they're a threat to themselves and or others. And so, how do we manage, how do we keep kids in school and engaged in school that don't want to be there, that are truly threatening in their behavior and make the environment difficult for anybody else to learn, if not impossible, to the other extent of, some kids go completely silent and they don't interact at all and they come, but they don't do any work. And then, and the next jump is, we have these highly capable learners that don't look highly capable. Like, oh, like he eats the money. Like there's no, he's high cap or he's flunking my class. He shouldn't be in advanced math or, they get in trouble. So, we kind of have this idea of an ideal student. And I think it exists, and I would love every kid to show up every day and learn with what we're providing them, assuming it's appropriate content. And it's, it's got that stretch where, okay, like you're starting here and we can push you to here, but we're not pushing you to here because it's too far. So that ideal range. So I guess to go back to your original question, we have to be safe to learn, because if we're not safe, all we're doing is guarding ourselves. And so again, there can be externalizing and internalizing behaviors. So there's a myriad of reasons why kids maybe aren't participating in their education, but really I think a lot of it comes down to safety, whether that be physical, social, emotional, mental, spiritual, access, really big about access. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes.
Certainly, it does. And what about things that, so going back to your special education background, how do you take the asynchronous development issues where it's connected to special education or what we thought of as special education?
Can you ask that again?
So when you have a child in the classroom and they are not acting typically, like they can't stay in their seat, They're throwing stuff around the room. Or just grabbing, or they're just like can't sit in their chair and they're uncomfortable. They slide out and somehow they magically end up under their desk. How do you view that? How do you acknowledge what's going on?
That could truly probably be its own podcast. So, really specific kids come to mind when you say that. So everything from elementary learners. I had a kindergartner that swore like a sailor. I mean, literally. And he completely would rip apart his classroom, not so much physically, but would not attend, didn't engage with his peers even remotely appropriately. I mean, that kid sat, I can't even tell you how many days outside of my office because he couldn't be in class because he literally could not function. So funny. So I had a typewriter in my office because that was still during the time that not everything was computerized, and I would have to do like envelopes with a typewriter or sometimes like fill out forms on district letterhead, or we'd get forms. So many forms as an administrator, but I'd have to like type those in. And there was one day he got up out of his seat and he stuck his head in and he's like, "What is that?" I said, "It's a typewriter." And he goes, "But what is it?" And I was like, that is such a good question. So that honestly, like that little tiny thing was the beginning of our relationship. He ended up in an alternative program. He also had multiple siblings. Family was Navy. So there's so many factors that were going into this little feller's behavior. And some of his behaviors were extremely mature, like his language use. But on the other hand, though, I don't think he had any way of knowing how to be in his skin. And so that's a term I use a lot. Like, if we're in a place that we don't know how to be in our skin, either it's going to get external, like I'm going to slide off my chair and be under my table because I literally don't know how to function in this environment. And that's a big deal when they're 15 and a half and like these giant man children. And they can be scary to some people. And so again, like, oh gosh, I could talk about our prison system or like juvenile detention. But okay, so I'm gonna go way back. So thinking about this, I've got a 15-year-old under the table. So one, it's not a good idea to push any type of mammal if they're scared or uncertain or sad. And so as we have this propensity as educators, because we have shit we have got to get done. And so whether it's content or their grades or meeting their IEP goals, like, we need to have data. And there's a total place for that. I'm actually so, so glad that our system is more data driven. But at the same time, if Kyle can't sit in his chair, we're not going to get a whole lot done. And so again, you look for the backstory. Kyle is financially responsible at 15 for his household. Mother has very severe multiple sclerosis, isn't mobile, can't work, is losing her sense of speech. Kyle has an older sister that also has a baby at 17. And Kyle literally is taking care of the household. So there were days like Kyle couldn't function because he didn't have any bandwidth left. He's tired. He's probably hungry. He didn't have a way to relate to school at all. And then that's also part of this system where it's like we have so much pressure as educators to move kids forward because we want them to graduate. Ideally it's 100% graduation. You can go back to probably I bet either one of you could step into a kindergarten or first grade room in about 10 seconds, be like, those are 4 kids that probably aren't going to graduate. And we know really early. In Laura's ideal world, like and I don't know I honestly don't know what the answer is for this, but doing a more asynchronous education system where it's like you kind of move on when you're ready. So you've got a high cap learner. I actually have a pair of twins right now. They're a once in a lifetime. I mean, these kids are profoundly quantitatively gifted. Don't play with peers. They read math books. They play number games. And so it's like, okay, they're turning 6. And it's like, I already know, like they honestly could probably be doing algebra. But then there's also this big developmental push of they need to get along with peers and they should follow directions and, they should be able to walk in a line and do this coloring and learn how to cut. And yes, I think those elements of learning and fine motor and socialization is really important. But if they're not doing math, they will not engage with you. And again, we can talk about the neuroscience behind that. So again, we can come at this from all different directions. There can be environmental factors, there's neurological factors, there's developmental factors. And because a kid can't or doesn't read, I'm a really big proponent that, literacy first and, and having science, social studies, even math around the context of literacy, particularly like in social studies and science. Oh my gosh. And as I said, I've led science, but it's such a great, like, so often our learners that, either aren't engaged in school because there's a disability or they have extreme ability, science and social studies, because a lot of times these kids are more interested from a very young age in nonfiction. That's a great avenue. High achievers generally have this massive sense of justice or injustice, fairness, unfairness. And a lot of times in elementary school, like, things aren't fair. And if you have a kid that's very rigid in their thinking about things being fair or unfair, and we're working on this system of equity, it's not always going to be fair. And I'm certain that you have come across learners that, like, they don't do school because there's too much fluidity and they can't function because it's not fair. And so classrooms don't make sense. And if a kid can't make sense of it, they're not going to engage with it. And some of them withdraw and some of them resist quite substantially in some circumstances.
Yeah.
So ideally, I would love to meet every kid where they're at and have this asynchronous development of, like, we kind of get rid of grades. But in all reality, I don't know how that's possible. And I know in Washington State, and particularly, I can speak to our district, funding is low. We have middle school classrooms with 37 kids in them.
Oh my God.
I know, it's
Wow.
too many learners. We can't differentiate with that many kids. I can't support a kid, again, like if you've got one under the table. And we actually have a pretty significant gang culture in our community. The schools have done a really great job at welcoming that, but also being very, very specific about behavioral boundaries.
Sure.
But with that said, we know that that sixth grade year is so critical with our kids entering middle school, because they're coming from this elementary environment that's extremely nurturing and, I would argue, more differentiated. And they get to middle school and it becomes this dit, 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 dit. And, everything from social and emotional issues to highly capable learners to students with special education. Again, how do we make this learning relevant? Because all they really all want to do is hang out with their friends, or not hang out with their friends and be socially withdrawn. Oh my gosh, I could talk forever about this. So, yes, I don't know if that addressed your question. So,
The next question is, well,
mm,
how do you deal with it? How do you,
mm.
as two ways, as a teacher and also even as an administrator, how do you support teachers and parents to recognize that, hey, they're not bad. They
Right.
just have this going on. And how do you do that? Because you obviously can't do it all on your own.
Mhm.
So there was something else I was going to just add before we jump
Yeah,
to that.
please.
I love how you mentioned that, like, you love that we're now at a time when we're more data driven because it helps us, right? We build the bigger portfolio. But at the same time, I can see you struggle with that too. That, gosh, if only I could meet each kid, like each learner where they are, instead of always having to be tied to, let's say an IEP or something, right? That there's trying to find that balance. And that's what I'm hearing here too, is that you're trying to find this balance between the two. And I just think that's interesting because I could see that's where the tension is here. You can appreciate that we're more data driven, but at the same time, we're struggling with that because did we go too far?
I think,
Yeah.
recognizing that tension and that conflict really, this is going to sound a bit Buddhist, which is funny coming from the firstborn to an immigrant family, but there's never going to be a solution. There just isn't. So there's not ever going to be an educational system or a learning system or behavioral system, despite our best efforts and everything we know now about development and social and emotional learning. There is not a clean, elegant system. I feel like we get to do the best we can with what we have.
Yeah, there's no one size fits all.
Yeah, there isn't. And just
Right.
because we are dealing with masses of people, I mean, it's high volume
Yeah.
and it's regulated, and we welcome everyone into our schools. That we've kind of got this whole thing, especially in special education and early education. So, parents are sending the best that they've got. They're not keeping the good kids at home. Like, we get the best that they can deliver.
That's a great way to think about it too.
I try. Some days I
I
do better.
don't know if a lot of, that's a good way to remind teachers too. Like, oh yeah, this is when your child is coming to school for because it's the beginning of the school year right now.
Mhm.
This is the best this kid is right now at this moment in time.
Well, and, the very generous thinking too, like, oh, parents are doing the best that they can.
Sure.
And I think probably 97% of the time, gosh, and parenting is that's a whole other thing, is parenting and how to support parents, kind of going back to your question, Barry.
Sure.
Okay, so I heard you say a couple of different things. So one of the things is like this idea of tracking versus the untracking. again, pros and cons. Some of that's really difficult to provide differentiated and specific instruction if you've got a heterogeneous classroom. Again, I know there's benefits to doing that. And with special education, for years, we literally would put kids in the basement and nobody else would see them. And it was this very contained, private, dare I say, sheltered environment. And so, a big push in special education has been inclusion. What we know in data and studies for like highly capable learners, it's actually, we see the most significant and substantial, and I would say relevant growth is when those kids are contained. Again, huge variety of reasons. We can go into that later. So there's schools, administrators, state directors, federal government, it's like everybody should be included. We need to go to this detracking model. And it's like, okay, I mean, to some degree, I can totally get behind that. But then that's also taken us away from like, oh, Karen and Barry can go do this math course as a sixth grader or as a ninth grader or as a 10th grader, but it's way outside the box. And our system resists, at least in my district, resists that really hard. Or like kids walking to read as third graders, like, oh no, like we all want them in the same group because they're all going to benefit. And there's this really unfortunate practice sometimes of like, oh, Karen is a highly capable learner, is going to help these other kids. It's like, one, that is not their job, not even
Right.
remotely. You are not there to help them. But then the other thing too is often our highly capable learners, because of their asynchronous development, they've known that they're different since they were about 3.5 or 4. They're not relating well to their peers for a variety of reasons, and they're not good teachers. And it takes a really long time to become a good teacher. And when you're 11,
Yes, it
your job is
does.
not to teach another kid how to read or do math or do some sort of scientific process. So that's kind of I don't know, the tracking versus untracking and the inclusion. Like, I guess my biggest things, I wish we had smaller classrooms. We need more space. We'd need more funding, but that would be a huge benefit. And I really like a block schedule, assuming instructors are using it appropriately. But like every district I either have previously been in, work in now, or know of, is everybody's moved away from block scheduling because it's too expensive. I can't afford it. And that really breaks my heart. And then there's this other thing of like, is our instruction being driven by data, what we teach when? And then like, can kids show mastery and move on to something else? Or do they still need to sit through the entire lesson, even though Barry can pass our like end of unit exam? He could pass right now at 100%, but he's got to sit through that whole unit because that's what he's doing. He wants to poke his eyes out with pencils. So we're kind of getting back into the behavioral component. If Barry can do all of the content, should he have to sit through it for compliance? I don't feel like that's a very good use of Barry's time or of his teacher's resources, but because that's what our system does right now. Like in Washington State, we've got Running Start, so students as high schoolers can access college level content at no cost when they're juniors, but they have to be a junior. So it gets really
Oh,
tricky to have these exceptional ninth graders that might not be able to organize their backpack or talk to a friend or take a bus, but like they can do advanced physics. And it's a really tricky place. Like, we're kind of talking about these two extremes of the bell curve, right? So we've got the masses here in the middle, special ed's out here, highly capable's over here. And we know the more profound the kid becomes out on the bell curve, the more differentiated they need their learning. So we're not talking about large groups of students, but they're highly impacting both in a gen ed classroom as obviously well in their own personal lives. And so kind of to go back to the original question of, thinking about supporting teachers and parents with these learners, like one, it is really critical that teachers and parents have some resources. Like in Washington State, we've got the Northwest Gifted Child Association run by Dr. Arnstein and Dr. Actually, she's not the head right now, but she was one of the first people that started it. Phenomenal organization. We have Washington, we have a statewide organization. We've got NAGC as the national organization. But again, we kind of go back to this thing of resources, time, money. So ideally, all of my middle school teachers that are teaching advanced classes would understand highly capable and asynchronous development. They don't.
mm,
Reasons why they don't. But how they teach, what they teach is really dependent on where a student is coming from developmentally. So ideally, I've got staff that understand asynchronous development as well as, social emotional learning and cognitive development in highly capable learners, as well as, this social emotional component of Kyle's under the desk. Again, he won't participate in class. He's not passing. He's not coming to school regularly. So it still comes back to me that parents and kids have to know they're safe because it is a big deal raising a child, special ed continuum or on the high capable continuum on that bell curve, because they really are quite profound and it's exhausting. And a lot of times parents don't feel safe because their kids are wigging out at school. And so they're embarrassed. They're like, they feel like they should be doing a better job. But these are very complex. I mean, we're all very complex humans, but especially when the main part of the system in the centralized bell curve, isn't meeting those needs, again, within school, outside of school. So I think one of the first things is really it's that recognition and acceptance, like, oh my gosh, you're not bad, your kid's not broken, and this we're not going to get this right the first time. So I especially like these younger families where we've got these really profound, like, the set of twins I have, like, we're not going to get this right the first time. And not unlike working with students with autism, something might work for a day or two or a couple of hours and then it doesn't. And so you kind of have to come up with this other thing. And sometimes we don't know until we try it and it doesn't work. But again, that takes time. It takes staffing resources. It takes facility resources and programming. And again, because everybody is truly, their plates are so full, and particularly in this heterogeneous model, there's not a lot of room, literally and figuratively, to support these asynchronous aspects, whether you're sped or high cap. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So, two things that you said I think are really important, which want to lead me into a third thing here, which is you keep coming back to safety and idea of a safe learning space. So I want to come back to that. And I also you talked about iteration. I would like to talk about that.
Okay.
And then I would like to talk about drilling down into examples. So let's start with safety. And what is, what does it, why is that so important? And take me into the skin of the learner and why safety, a safe learning space is so important and why that's your first adaptive connection.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So I'm going to divert from like education for a moment. So one of my side hustles is I actually do equine assisted therapy and learning with at-risk kids, and particularly girls that have been sexually trafficked. And that's not all I do, but that's kind of one of the big parts. So, kids that have had insecurity of housing, food, safety. If you're in this protective, and we've known this for a long time with developmental psychology, if you're in a space where I don't feel safe or you're heightened emotionally, you have a lot of cortisol in your system, like, your system is being hijacked, your amygdala is running overdrive all the time. There literally is not space in your brain to make connections between learning relevance, experience, and like a delayed outcome. Like, one example is like I work with our county's equine rescue program. And so I restart horses to ideally either have them be rehomed or just that they're not going to be with humans ever again because they're not safe. And so, if I've got a horse that is completely petrified, I am not going to be able to have any kind of significant learning or relearning with that animal until they're not frightened for their lives. So we are not unlike horses in that we're fight or flight creatures. And even though we are predators and horses are prey, if we have an at-risk kid that has had insecurity of food, housing, safety, they are prey. And we have kids that come into our system, and this isn't even talking about twice or thrice exceptional learning. We have kids that come into our system that have been preyed upon. So maybe not literally physically, but there's other forms of insecurity that has caused them to be like, students that come to our country and into our educational system from other places that have been in civil war. Their families have been threatened or have been unsafe. In our community, we have a very high Hispanic population. And so, we have kids here that have come to our country unaccompanied. And so they're without their families and they're trying to survive. So if we're in survival mode, there is not any external learning. So you've got the whole Maslow hierarchy. If I don't have my lower needs
Yeah.
being met, I'm not going to be moving up into any kind of a circumstance. So that's not to say they should be coming to school. So like I'm thinking of a middle schooler who would come to school every day, didn't learn. And so again, I am not going to approach her about learning until she literally feels safe in her body and her her cortisol is not spiking off the chart. Like her system has settled so that she's not constantly worrying about being attacked. Like, or like, yesterday I spent the day in a kindergarten. Yesterday was our first day of kindergarten. They start a couple of days later than our first through second grade, first through 12th grade population. So first day of kindergarten, this little feller, big kid for his age, which has all kind of connotations as well, but he is like falling apart and clinging onto his mom and sobbing, like, please don't leave me. I don't want to stay. And like, he's starting to hyperventilate. And mom is like, but you said you were excited and we love coming to school. And I'm like, he is not hearing you. He's so freaked out that you're going to leave him here. Nothing you can say is going to help. So eventually the teacher was like, why don't you just go? So I literally sat in front of the door so he couldn't run out. And it feels a little bit mean, but he stood next to me, was like, but they're like, the teacher was like, well, come over here and you have friends and look, there's coloring. I'm like, oh my gosh, just stop talking to him. He can't hear you. You're going to dull him to your request, just like, we'll dull a very scared horse, because I don't want to like hog tie him and make him go to the carpet. So we just waited, and it took about 20 minutes. And she asked about something, and he raised his hand and he walked over voluntarily. So again, do we have space in our system for kids that are coming with this heightened social and emotional component? And whether it's because I have never fit into school, I hate it here, I have no friends, it's not relevant, but I'm going to come because it's what I do, but I'm not going to engage with you. Or a kid that is like, I have to come and I'm going to fight you every step of the way. But it's like, can I just let them be? Because as a teacher, as a staff person, we have to learn. I need you to learn. We need to get our data. Again, super relevant, but either whether you're a kindergartner or an 8th grader and you're like, I'm here, but I hate it, they're not going to engage.
You had a thought. I
Yeah,
did
sorry.
too. So no, it's good. It's great.
So I'm really enjoying this. So we think of trauma usually in these places that you've talked about, and you started to touch on the other kind of trauma that's important, and let's call it educational trauma, or trauma that comes from being a part of the system or engaging in the system, or the misfit of the person and the system. How do you see that? How do you support it?
I'm really careful about the use of the word trauma, because if we're talking like about clinical trauma, there's very specific things that are happening neurologically and systemically, physiologically in our bodies. I do think there's educational trauma. Like in Washington State, we used to have boarding schools for Native Americans and First Peoples. That was traumatic. I mean, there was abuse, there was neglect, there was deliberate cultural erasure. Like, that is traumatic. You're literally taking away things that are a critical component of our being. We have kids that don't fit into our educational system. And I don't know so much that I would call that traumatic. I think it can be enormously difficult. I don't know what word I would use with that, Barry. We're going to have to think on that. But with that said, if they've always had experiences where they never fit in, and again, by the time they're like 13, 14 and school starts to matter, because, they really are learning critical organizational and thinking, problem solving skills that's going to carry them into content. There's that whole adage, like in elementary school, where we're learning to read and we're learning math, but like, you start in secondary that you're doing math to learn and you're reading to learn. And so again, if we don't have students that have these really basic learning skills because they haven't been safe, and whether that's cultural, academically, I would get these kids as at-risk 9th graders, both as a teacher and as an administrator, that like they really hated school. They didn't connect with school in any way. So that's one of those things like, oh my gosh, like I would love to take all of them and just like have them come month to a year until they're like, oh, like I can do school. There is a place for me here. And, we might not call it school. It might be, I don't know, academic opportunity. I'd want to be careful, but I think it's relevant to call it school, to take that time of like, hey, this is a place where are you familiar with Avid? The Avid
Yes.
program?
We
Okay.
have Avid here.
Like, Avid
Yep.
does an exceptional job. Like, here's where you belong. Here's how you do school. There is a place for you, but it's taking off that requirement, or there's a word I'm looking for here that I can't find. Like the huge need that you have to do school, like let's just have you be. And again, and if we had something that wasn't 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and like Karen could take, maybe it's a year, I would still want relevant learning opportunities, but it might not be ELA, math, science, social studies, PE. Oh my gosh, like how many highly capable learners do you know that hate PE? or recess. It starts, you hate recess and they hate EE, but
Yes.
by golly, they've got to do it because it's the state requirement. Stuff like that drives me nuts. I think that's dumb. Like if you can't participate in an activity or even if you refuse, why would I make you do it knowing you're going to fail?
Right. And Avid does such a great job of teaching kids.
Yes.
Like it takes it and breaks down the process of learning for kids who just, like sometimes we just expect them to know how to learn, to come to
Yep.
school and just know how to learn.
Oh my gosh. And if we have a kid that's good at math, we expect that they're good learners. Like, oh my gosh, they didn't learn how to do math in the traditional
Right.
way. And they're not, oh my gosh, like how many highly capable learners do you know that are not good learners? They're
Yeah.
not good
Oh,
students.
oh,
Or like things have been easy, and they hit 11th grade or their college junior year and they completely fall apart because their identity has been wrapped up. I am good at this and now I'm not. So I'm stupid or I'm bad or I'm worthless. And the mental health implications of that is huge.
it's huge. They didn't learn how to learn, that there's an actual process to
Right.
learning. And
And
so they
even if
never
like you
learned
can be
that.
bad at this and still be a good person or like, because
Yeah.
we talk a lot about in our self-contained program here in the district, like we do want things to be hard and we don't expect you to get it right the first time. Because generally these are kids that have been getting it right for the first time and they're not very good learners because
Wow.
they honestly haven't, they don't know how to learn. There's not a process. And God bless teachers that are working with kids. Like our current math curriculum, like it's more about learning how to do it. I'm an algorithm person. Like, thank God I didn't go through elementary, middle, and high school. Like, let's figure this out together. I'm like, hell no. Like, I'm a firstborn immigrant kid from a German family. Like, no. We have to get it right the first time. So it would have driven me nuts. It's also why I don't like chemistry. It's too hard. It's not, it's not linear. I can't see it. Anyway, I diverge. I'm done.
So let's talk about being a family of immigrant family and how did that affect your perspective on other kids in respecting cultural differences?
Hmm.
And yeah, let's start with that and then we'll get into iteration.
So, Barry, do you want me to answer that from like a personal perspective or like my current kind of professional perspective?
I don't know necessarily that they don't overlap
Okay,
75%.
Yeah, I was going to
sure.
say, I think there's probably a big overlap there.
Okay. So, I'm white, I'm very Caucasian. And so there's a lot of assumptions made if you're Caucasian about where you've come from or how you've grown up. So I was so uncool growing up.
That's hard to believe. I'm sorry.
Oh my gosh. No, truly. It was really, it still can be really painful. So, we also moved around a lot when I was a kid because my dad was always looking for better work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent the preponderance of my early academic years on the East Coast, which is very, very different from the West Coast, politically, demographically, geographically. So I actually started school very ready to learn. I started reading at a very early age. I'm very thankful for that because on the one hand, it contributed to, I escaped in books all the time. And again, my dad was extremely volatile and my mom was in so far over her head to manage our family. And so I guess without getting too personal, again, just really struggled at home growing up. So I was a big reader and like, thank God. And I also had family along the East Coast. So we took a lot of car trips and I got really, really car sick as a kid. And it's like we tried to do other things, but reading was my escape. So I eventually, after throwing up enough times, I can read in the car now, like over the most horrific roads. Started school on time, did kindergarten. I told my kindergarten class there was no Santa Claus and that the teacher was lying and I didn't do it to be malicious. And I started kinder later in this district because we moved when I was in kindergarten. But I remember sitting on the floor and this teacher like coming at me and I didn't do it to be bad. I was like, you're
Sure.
lying to this whole group of children. And so got in a ton of trouble. So I learned really early on that you don't necessarily speak truth in class and that you kind of need to go along with the program. So I was accelerated in second grade and I went into a classroom with a third grade teacher. And I very specifically remember like my first 5 minutes. And then like I threw up because I was so anxious. And because I grew up in a violent household, like again, like, I have these systems set up to kind of protect myself. And I'm a highly sensitive person, which I learned about through my therapist. And not like, oh, my feelings get hurt easily, but we take in stimulus in a different way.
Yeah, you're like an empath.
I've ever looked into high sensitivity. It's freaking magical. The author is also tremendous that did the early work. So anyway, going to this classroom, throw up, and other kids are like, ew, my teacher got really mad. And so I only lasted about a day and a half because like I was like, I can't do this. Didn't want to go to school. I got really physically sick. So then I ended up in Mrs. Hartso's class. Like I still remember exactly where everything was and Mrs. Hartso. And so ended up in like this accelerated group of kids. And I went with them through elementary and started middle school on the East Coast. And so I stayed with the same group of kids. And that was one of those circumstances like, oh my gosh, like there's people like me. And, but at the same time, again, I was so introverted and really struggled to make friends. And like, we bought all my clothes at Kmart. I started soccer. We moved out here. I caught the very end of middle school in Washington. And because we're a German family, like soccer and tennis were really the only sports I was ever exposed to. And I was not a good tennis player. And I grew up with my dad just serving like balls at me, and it was petrifying. So anyway, started playing soccer. But like we went to Kmart and he bought me like softball cleats, and I didn't know the difference. And like Wrangler jeans, but I did know I wanted Jordache jeans, but my family wouldn't buy them because they were too expensive. My dad thought it was so horrifically ridiculous that I would want a certain type of jeans. So, this
Sure.
is from the father that grew up in post World War II Germany. Like they didn't have food. So who cared what kind of jeans I wanted? So I remember the first pair of Guess jeans that I bought that had like the zippers up the sides. You probably remember these, Karen. So
Yes,
anyway,
I do.
so I show up for my first day of soccer practice. I'm late to the team. I've never been on a team before either. I have no concept of what this looks like in my soccer cleats. And the first thing the coach is like, you can't play. Those are the wrong shoes. I didn't know, but again, I am getting in trouble because I'm doing the wrong thing. So again, you do the wrong thing, but you don't even know what the right thing is. And so, there's this process, and whether it be cultural or linguistic or social, that like you do these wrong things, but you don't know what the right thing is. So despite your best efforts to be included, to do the right thing in school, because really we all want to do the right thing. We don't like being in trouble. We don't like being excluded. It's so hard on our internal systems, like physiologically, but it's like despite our best efforts, we never do the right thing and we get in trouble for it. You stop trying.
So how did that give you empathy for other kids who, for whatever their cultural differences, or
It's a
any
really
difference whatsoever, how did you build that and how did that affect how you teach?
right. Especially when I started the alternative school when I was in Stanwood we called it Lincoln Hill High School eventually. But so it's funny because I've never used drugs. I've never drank. And some of it, thank God, because I was like the poster child for being an incredibly at-risk child. But I had really strong convictions about that early on. And my family didn't. So not that that necessarily stops a teenager. Anyway, and I wondered that for a really long time because I'm not, when I look from the outside, the person that would work with at-risk kids, because generally, like, a lot of the people that I worked with, especially in Seattle at the youth drop-in facility, these are people that had been users themselves or had been homeless themselves, or they themselves have like some sort of clinical neurological thing going on. And so a lot of those people were drawn to working with kids like us to help protect them and support them. So anyway, but I think it's that I truly always thought there was something wrong with me and that I couldn't figure things out. And I was never smart enough. I was never good at like the things my dad would say to me, like when we would work on our homework. And my parents also had an atrocious divorce. And so that's a whole nother thing. But I don't know. I guess this idea that like, especially too, because I work with horses and restart horses, but there's this part like, if we can be quiet enough and like have our feelers out and be vulnerable enough that you literally can feel when somebody's like, I am freaking out inside and I have no idea how to manage this. And it makes us extremely vulnerable, but I didn't really have any other way of experiencing the world. Like I tend to operate kind of wide open, which can actually be really difficult, but I don't really have any other way to be. That's a whole other, I have a really good therapist. But then I think the other thing about that is that I really do believe in education is our opportunity. It's an opportunity for
Mhm.
exposure. It's an opportunity for learning, but it's also like you don't know what's out there until you know what's out there. So particular students that are coming from different backgrounds, coming to our country for a variety of reasons, or even just from socioeconomic backgrounds and they're Caucasian, have lived here their whole lives, that you truly, you don't know what's there until you know what's there. And ideally in education, we're providing opportunities. There's a program that we have in our district called he sits right across from me here in the office. It's like a college readiness. I'm going to have to get back to you. I can't think what it's called. it's a college readiness program, but like they take students starting as freshmen to college campuses, and they have guest speakers, and they have
Nice.
people from all different types of careers come in. And what's beautiful about our community is we have people at high professional levels that are Latino and that are multilingual. And so that whole idea of like, I get to see people like me doing these things, that's been a really big push, like in early literature as well. Like, it's really hard for us to imagine something that we've never seen, or to have
Sure.
any sort of context for like, this is possible. Yes. So it's really bugging me. I can't think of the name of that program.
Empathy.
Empathy. Well, I think once you've been a person, really, we kind of have two paths. If you've been a person that's experienced trauma or truly difficult circumstances, and particularly when you're an early learner, you don't have the coping mechanisms. And, I'm thinking smaller children. You don't have the tools to guide you through that process. And so here you end up at 25 and you're like, I have no idea how I got here or how to not be here, even if I don't want to be here. I think there is something about, there's this whole idea of hurt people. But then there's also this idea of that hurt people recognize hurt people. And how do we approach a child, a learner that's been in a difficult circumstance without making them feel dumb, or that they should know how to do this thing, they don't. But it's like, oh my gosh, like, I'm just glad you're here. Like, if somebody had just said that to me, and even when people say that to me now, it is so impactful and powerful.
Yes.
The side, there's these first level of things of like, oh, teachers greet their kids at the door, and you learn their names within the first couple of days, and we use their names. That's kind of a first order thing, and that's great. I think it's really critical, but that also needs to be a piece of, I do want you to bring your whole self. And yes, you're going to write about things that might not make sense to me, or yes, I understand that this math has no context for your life at all. But if you can just trust me a little bit that I am doing this for a reason. But again, that goes back to that trust factor. And that whole idea, we're not going to I can't have empathy for you if you don't trust me, that we're truly going to get through this together. Because we use those words a lot. And especially a kid that has experienced difficult circumstances, they're not going to believe you, even with your best intentions. And so there's this whole idea of consistency. If I'm going to be empathetic, I do need to have a longitudinal relationship generally with someone. I mean, granted, there's that idea of like, oh, buy the coffee for the person behind you. You're probably going to make their day. I'm all about that. But it's also, if I've only got a kid for a semester or a quarter, that is really difficult to build an empathetic, like a naturalistic relationship that gets to grow. And, I do think like those teachers that all kids like, and that have like this school-wide reputation of, oh my gosh, like we love her, we love him, like we love that teacher. That institutional empathy, I guess, for lack of a better word, like, we've got these staff that kids know, and they can come into their classroom already knowing they're going to be safe. But again, that takes time and effort. And if I have 37 kids and I'm trying to teach math, how do I get back to empathy when there is a ton of pressure on staff to do their kids
Yeah.
for?
But I think even before, when you talk about empathy, there's something you brought up that I think is so important, that it actually, like, if you take a half step back from there, it starts with authenticity, right?
Yep.
Because if the kids just know, they know if you're real and if you truly mean
And
what
they
you
might not be
say,
able to identify it, but they
right?
feel
But
it.
they can't articulate it, but yeah, they definitely feel it. And I think those are the teachers that even I remember as the
Yes.
ones who were really, they meant it when they said, I'm so glad you're here today.
It's like, imagine doing that for like 120 kids a day.
Right.
It's exhausting. Like,
Yeah.
how do I feed teachers and feed parents? You've got this really intense kid. I mean, how do you do that with 120 people a day?
Probably the most defeating thing for me once as a teacher was at the end of a year, a child has said to me,
Mhm.
"Well, I thought you really, really didn't like me." I'm like, "What? I really like you a lot." That's not the way it is. It was really, it's hard, because you don't know what another person is thinking. And unless you really do one-on-one acknowledge, and it's on one hand, you want to exude goodness and love and care and support and trust. But the other part too, like you said, is that you have to really let each person know. So, which is a good cue for me to say, Laura, I'm really glad you're here.
It'll make me cry. Like,
Okay.
another thing too with that, it's like, but just like with at risk, with these horses that I get that have been, I am going to use the word traumatized, it's my actions that are going to count though more than my words, because again, I'm not going to hear you as a person if I've been injured. It's because I am watching. I am not listening at all. I'm just
Right.
watching because I want to make sure you're not going to eat me. And but it is, there's a point where it's like, if Kyle's under the desk, I'm not going to try to talk to Kyle. Like Kyle's going to have to come out of his own volition. So how long does Kyle get to stay there? What's he doing while he's under there? Does he have food and water? And I say that, I guess, a little bit sarcastically, but it's also like, what need is that meeting? And how can I meet Kyle's need if he can come out from under the desk and participate? I also really specifically remember, so I had this multicultural learner as a ninth grader in my alternative class, and he hated to write. I mean, like literally kick and screaming. He was a big kid too. And we had to do poetry. It's part of ninth grade ELA. So we had this poetry unit, made these little slips of paper for topics. And one of the topics was I hate poetry. And God bless the universe, he got I hate poetry. That kid wrote a poem because for him, like, he's like, I could relate to that. And it wasn't a very good poem. And we laughed about it, but it's like, that was one of the first real authentic times. Well, the other thing too, it's like, we have particularly some of these at-risk learners, and our highly capable learners are extremely sarcastic and can be quite caustic. I also work really hard. There's that line about respecting your teacher, but it's also like, can I take a few hits? Like I had kids make fun of my hair. I've had kids make fun of my name. I have a little bit of a lisp. And so it's also like, can I take that and not have my feelings hurt and still have a relationship with you? Because they're going to check on that. Like, can you take this from me? Or like, am I going to get in trouble?
Oh, they're always checking boundaries.
No.
Always.
And they should. I
Yes.
want them to. But it's also that thing, because sometimes as adults, we get our feelings real hurt, and like we expect kids to kind of toughen up, or like kind of, I hate to use this term, but like man up, which is a stupid phrase, but we expect them to be like, oh, like you can take it. You're being bullied, just you got to rise above it. But it's like, if I can't take it, my words
Right.
mean absolutely nothing.
That's right. You are right.
And there's kids that know more than me, and I'm not going to try to pretend that I know it all. Because that's a surefire way to have them be like, you're stupid. And I probably am stupid. And it's like, can I be stupid? Like, yeah, I can be I'm stupid a lot. I don't mind that. But I don't know a lot of
I
adults
have
that can
like
be like, I don't mind being
12-year-olds who
stupid.
are beyond me in physics. Like I will never get to that point of math or physics, right? That they are. And
Yeah.
okay, but we all have our strengths.
I've got a senior right now that's like already like, he's talking to NASA about jobs. I'm not going to be talking about NASA about jobs ever. But like, he's been studying quantum physics since he was 9.
Yeah.
Like, what do we do with that kid in school? He doesn't really have a real significant place either in our mainstream high school, which actually has got a really great science program, or our community college. He's maxed out on math and science. So, like, where do you go from there?
So I want to come back to, I'm not trying to beat a dead horse, but
Oh, beat away. I beat horses all the time. I don't really beat them.
that would be traumatizing. So speaking of trauma, I want to come back to it because I do believe that there are different levels of trauma, but it's not the kind of trauma that you initially talked about, such as extreme violence and things like that. But I do believe, back to your reference, so people who are highly sensitive and having sensory issues, intense sound can be very traumatic in a moment. I feel very strongly that in a math class that a child can be so afraid of making a mistake that it has some level of trauma that they experience.
Yep.
One of the things that you also talked about too, I don't know if you said it directly or indirectly, identity preservation trauma. And
Mhm.
how does a child preserve their self-worth and their identity? And I'm saying this because I really want to just come back and summarize a little bit all the things that you've said, because a lot of what you did not say today were he's having a hard time sitting, let's give him rubber bands on the end of his chair, or let's put him on a bouncy seat. It's more of how to be emotionally adaptive, how to sense and feel the other person, and how to try to figure out what it is that's putting them in a dysregulated state where they're not feeling safety. And I think the word dysregulation to me is part of why I use the word trauma, even though it's not as extreme as you talked about, because anything I feel that pushes us out of a good educational learning experience starts with them not feeling educational self-regulation. I don't know if I just made up a term like that, but
Well, right. Yeah, we'll have to explore that too.
thanks. So, but and I think that's what you're really getting at was this really nice feel and flow where you have studied and you've learned a lot of things and you're data driven and you really are interested in being very focused and doing things well within that German culture of being very well structured, right? But at the same time, you also are very emotive and not emotive, but empathetic to emotions. And that you really know that or can tell that when a child is not right is because something's happening to them and they're not, and that dysregulation is keeping them from actively engaging as a learner.
I feel incredibly blessed. I've never struggled with depression. There's been other things I've struggled with, but not depression. And when we have a population or singularities of people that are experiencing traumatic and or just extremely difficult circumstances, we get very depressed. And again, I just think I am so damn lucky that that is not something that my brain needed to do. And so, there's because the depression is a way of self-protection, but it also becomes a habitual way of thinking and being. And so if we've got a learner that maybe literally since birth has been depressive for a variety of circumstances and reasons, they might show up as a seventh grader and we assume that they are the way they are because they're being bad. And I feel like for most of our learners, there's some exceptions and they're deliberately malicious. But again, I think that's for different reasons. It can be a learned behavior. But I had this vision when you were talking about of this seventh grade girl walking into a classroom, attitude, mean or language. It's like generally our first assumption as an educator is to be like, she's doing something wrong. She's being bad. One of the most significant things I'm working on removing from my lexicon is good, bad, right, wrong. And if I can approach a learner like that, so rather than she's being bad, but again, this is from this really early education of abnormal development. Like, we generally, our behavior is reflective of something that we've learned or experienced. And so it's like, gosh, like if I can help her, not even help her, if I can be the person or provide the circumstance where she can get to know herself, then that's going likely to resolve a lot of behavioral issues. But again, that takes time, it takes effort, it takes resources, and it takes a place. And in public education, we don't really have a place for kids to be like, oh, this is who I am. Like, I'm in my 50s and I've gone to a lot of therapy and I really only feel like I'm arriving at myself now. And it's like,
Mm.
now? Like, why couldn't this have happened 30 or 40 years ago? Like my dad just got diagnosed with PTSD. And again, that's a phrase I use very specifically. Like people are like, oh, I have PTSD. And it's like, okay, maybe you do. But again, I feel like we also kind of throw that around now with trauma. But when I'm using that in a circumstance with a child, like he finally got on medication. My dad is 85 years old. His anxiety is through the roof. It's debilitating. He's probably not going to get to drive anymore because like he's losing it on the road. But he just started some antipsychotic medication that's proving to be helpful. It's like, oh my gosh, like, can you imagine what the world would be like if my dad had started on that, I don't know, 75 years ago, 80 years ago, when as a child, if he had had a chance to be and not that meds are the only way, but it helps a lot that, to be regulated and to be able to navigate circumstances and to look at something like, oh, like, I don't want to react like that. It's like this. Because again, if we're coming from this place of this elevated, dysregulated, internalized view of the world, like I'm going to react. And we've got these kids that just spend every minute of their day reacting. They don't ever get to be. I read this really interesting book recently, and his whole premise is that like we actually don't have personalities. We're just a collection of coping mechanisms. So again, if I'm thinking about, okay, education really it's a method of coping because it's a way of learning and responding to the world. Like
Sure.
what about how do I create a learning experience where it's like, it's not a coping mechanism. I'm not having them react to a situation, but like you're saying, they get to initiate a response to the situation that might be different than they've ever done before. Oh my gosh, like, but that process is huge because you're literally rewiring your brain to respond in that way. So until I've got a place or a classroom or a program service model that kids get to show up as themselves and then they get to learn. I mean, it can go hand in hand, but kind of to your point, Barry, that if I show up and I'm doing it wrong and I'm learning that I'm always wrong and I have to show my work or I need to answer in this way or I have to sit through this class even though I can already do it all, my educational self-regulation is going to be out the window.
See, I
Because
think you brought up an amazing point though, Laura. Like when you were comparing yourself and your dad and the seventh grader, like the thing is that we feel like this about ourselves as adults now. We're like, wow, why did this take me so long? But then we don't take the same level of grace and empathy to our learners, and they show up and somehow it triggers us. But why would we expect a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old to kind of
any
have it
12 or
together?
13-year-old, any of
Anyone,
them.
right? Any of them. And the thing is, it's like, wait a second. So in our process of growing and developing, we're learning to have grace for ourselves and forgiveness for ourselves. But because our class sizes are large, because we have the scope and sequence that's just pushing, and we have this pressure that we've got to be pushing, like it's got to be curriculum all the time rather than relationships and communication. I think it puts our kids and us to setting us up not to be successful, but to fail.
I need to be really careful of what I expect from my learner.
Right.
Because I do think there's a lot of adults that expect respect just because.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of like,
I've seen
yeah,
those
I
teachers.
call a little bit of BS on that because I honestly don't expect kids to walk. I expect them to be reasonable to me, but I don't expect a kid to show up and disrespect me. I really don't. I haven't earned it. I have done nothing. I've done nothing for them to be like, oh, yeah, like I trust you. Let's go on this journey together. And I think that's a huge fallacy. And, actually it's interesting too, because, we've got, I'm going to make a little bit of a jump here, but like, especially these twice exceptional learners, and they're often seem to be big kids. And so it's like, you might have an 8-year-old, but he looks like an 11-year-old. And so people talk to him like he's 11,
Sure.
12 or 13. And there's this expectation because you're high cap or because you're big that like you can behave in a certain way. But it's like, oh my gosh, like their poor little prefrontal cortex is like, they're working their asses off really until we're
Smooth.
about 25. And so it's like, we have these expectations for kids. And please know, like I expect kids to show up at school and to work. They're very hardest. And I expect for them to learn stuff and to show up and be ready. But that's my expectation that I'm placing on them. And if that hasn't been provided on the front end, I'm not going to
Right.
show up to school ready to learn. There's that whole ACEs scale. It came out years ago and it's been modified several times. But, just in the general population, and most of us have had a variety of adverse childhood experiences. And because we're humans and we are so messy and there's no such thing as a good daughter. I really would offer like, there's really no such thing as good parenting because it's such a fluctuating process because it's all about relationship. And so it's like, am I the driver of my parenting or is my child the driver of my parenting? It's this coexisting because it used to be like, Dr. Spock, right? Like the parent lays down the rules and like, you've got to do it this way. But kids resist that because it's like, well, I'm not that human. But yeah, we know so much more now. Well, and I guess to really quickly go back to like, I had a kid in when I was an elementary principal, and this kid, truly so much trauma, early abuse, highly, highly capable learner. His emotional, he was raw, always emotional, lots. He was super, super, super vulnerable. And he would run. Like he would literally like leave his classroom and run out. And it's like, okay, it's obvious he needs an escape mechanism. So he and I made a deal where I wouldn't call the police if I could see him. So when he was lucid and able to come and talk and he would like literally shake when you'd talk to him. I remember this so distinctly. And his mother also worked at my school. So there was a track outside. So it's like, okay, Connor, you can leave through this door and go to the track. And there were some days like in the track was also fenced, but it's like he would need to leave. And so we also, with mom's permission, we also prescribed a route that left campus. And I was like, but on those times, I do have to call the police, but they're not going to chase you and I will run with you. So as long as you can see me, like some days I'm not going to have shoes on that I can run in, but as long as you can see me, you can go. So we had this kind of planned lined out. So rather than you're in trouble because you're running, and he literally had no other choice because if he didn't run, he would start like literally breaking the room apart. And I was like, I would much rather have you go out and move your feet than dismantle this room and scare the shit out of every other kid in here. So it's like we had this running plan. But again, that is a super outside the box expectation. And as the principal, I could be like, yes, we are doing that. But oftentimes classroom teachers, again, if you've got 37 kids and we have lots of safety procedures and protocols, and like, now we buzz into all of our buildings, there is this huge I'm obligated to keep my kids safe. But it's like, we have kids that come in, the last thing they need to do is sit in a chair and listen to me talk about civil rights. Like, I wish they could just literally go out and move their feet safely, because we know body movement contributes to social and emotional well-being. And in my 6 or 7 period day, most of their word about staying safe and how do I look to my peers. And so it's like, and PE is scary because the girls don't want to wear shorts and the boys don't want to, and I'm going to look weak to somebody else. Anyway, I have this whole thing about PE. So this kind of goes back to like, gosh, if I could minister to every kid as an individual with exactly what they need to be in school, they probably would be more successful. But how do I balance that with a very finite budget, with very finite facilities? I don't know what the answer is to that, because I want them all to come. I mean, I want every kid to show up every day. Where do we put them? How do we house them? How do we feed them? How do we supervise them? Yeah.
Amazing.
I really appreciate how you give a good balance between being a classroom teacher and being an administrator, and how you have to struggle between the different needs of both, and also just being a person who cares about other people. I think that's an important message for everybody to understand, is that the lines are not us versus them, teachers versus administration, parents versus teachers, teachers and parents versus administration against a special ed administrator. I mean, there's a lot of frustration and there's a lot of pressure, and we need to look at where the pressure really comes from. To me, the pressure is really a culture that no longer keeps up with how teachers see kids anymore, or how we're learning that this is not how to be successful with kids and with other adults and with older than us, younger than us. And I really appreciate how you bring that to life. Do you want to reflect on that for a moment?
Gosh, I mean, what is American culture without pressure? Where would we be? I guess on the one hand, that whole idea of like, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, I could get real dark about that really fast if I'm honest. And I will be public about this. I did not know until college that like Columbus didn't discover America, that there were people here with, oh my gosh, these amazing societies and advanced medicine and government and relationships and ways of being and surviving. I literally had no idea. And I think that was one of those moments for me, like, gosh, I think I was 19. Seriously was like, oh my gosh, like, if I didn't know that truth, like how much else do I not know? And one of my mechanisms growing up is I was a total know-it-all. Like I was always first kid with my hand up in class, and grades mattered to me. And I worked really, really hard to be successful at school. And it's like at that point, the other thing too, because I grew up very, very sheltered. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, linguistically and culturally. So when I was a kid, my family actually first immigrated to Baltimore. And I thought Baltimore was all German because we went to a German church, we went to German stores. I was only around German speaking people. Like literally, I thought all of Baltimore was German. Right. Like the look on your face. Right. So, and then like when I moved to the West Coast, it was like, oh my gosh, like everybody's white. Like that was super weird. And because I was 13-ish and, and then to college, like, oh my gosh, like my whole life, again, like there's no Santa Claus in kindergarten, that lie that got me in so much trouble. Like we didn't discover shit. Like, again, there's this whole way of being on this continent that I had no idea about. And that was one of those, like, I have gotten so much wrong. I don't know if I really want you to put this in the podcast. You can, but I was also involved. I no longer ascribe to the same spiritual belief system, but I was also involved in this extremely conservative Christian organization on campus. And I still apologize. It's probably every other day, like to the universe. Like I feel so bad for these people, like that would just be in the hub trying to have their lunch and probably studying madly for some sort of an exam. Be like, do you know Jesus? And I look back and I was like, so presumptuous, so invasive. And I'm so embarrassed about that. But it's like, you kind of asked about, relating to others, but I still bring, I'm not going to say guilt. That's not the right word, but really this sense of responsibility. Like I don't know anything. And for me to assume anything about you, the way you look, the language you speak, how you dress, the the accent that you have, like the way you sit in a room or enter a room or exit a room, or the way you talk to your parents, or, how you approach lunchtime in the cafeteria. Like, I don't know anything. I really don't know anything. And the world is infinite in the possibilities that we have with the relationships in our lives. And thinking about, like, in a cosmic sense, again, we don't know anything. We are this tiny speck of being. And it doesn't stress me out at all. It doesn't bother me at all. I don't mind being a speck, because it's like, I am so freaking lucky that I get to do what I do. And again, I just have so much to learn still. And that's where I guess that opportunity of, like, what do I get to learn from you? And if I can approach my kids like that, rather than, I'm going to teach you this, and I know, and I've got to
Mhm.
know all the answers. Like, again, I don't have all the answers. I mean, how much of a struggle do we all have daily to just kind of get through the day in big and small ways? There's just still so much to learn. So I have to be really careful of my own coping mechanism, but then also kind of growing up that, like, I know better than anybody else. I must have been so awful in elementary school. Again, I don't know shit. So there's a lot to learn.
That's amazing. Like, I'm so glad you have that. And this is why I just adore you too. It's just a human being, Laura, because I feel your authenticity and I feel your like humbleness, the humility and your modesty that I think sometimes it comes with age, life experience and some age too, that we don't know everything. And
It's
it
also, I think,
just
comes from a place of fear for me, though, as well. That's like, I've embarrassed myself, I mean, an infinite number of times, and I don't really like embarrassing myself.
sure.
And it's like, the less I assume, like, the less I'm in a place that I have to protect myself, really. And that honestly has become a lot more comfortable than, like, I have to know everything to protect myself, because that's a huge fallacy.
Sure.
And in our culture, like in this place, like, we're kind of supposed to know everything, and like, you go as far as you can and you get there, and like, you keep pushing. I mean, I like to push, don't get me wrong, and I love productive conflict. But there's also an element that none of it's, what's the value in that?
Right.
If you want to be a quantum physicist because you truly, that's what's driving your entire being, please be a quantum physicist. If you could be a quantum physicist, but you want to make hats, please go make hats.
Right.
Because we're this little infinitesimal speck on the planet for the blink of an eye.
So what I feel like we've really gotten today, when we started talking a while ago, we were talking about what is it we do at Spiral We. We talked about spiral adaptive lens and making adaptive connections. And I think what's really special that we had with you today here is that you went into a lot of directions on how someone can have that spiral adaptive lens, that open attitude. And people don't have to agree with everything that you've said or each opinion that you've had, although I'm very comfortable with all of them. But it's the fact that you've had an open approach, that you've had an empathetic approach, and that you are willing to accept each person and to understand that there's a story behind each person, and that to be an effective educator, your goal is to make sure that they feel safe and to have educational self-regulations before they can even try to learn something, that they can feel relaxed enough to do that. And I think all of the stories and all of the places and the path that you brought us today was a really good, powerful example of that. So thank you. And I'm glad you were here.
Thank you for having me.
It's been amazing just to hear your story. And I think there's so many people who are going to watch this podcast and feel like they're going to identify with you. You are so real and so beautiful. And thank you so much for being open to share your story with us, because I've seen you in the classroom too, and you are a phenomenal teacher. I mean, you're like the teacher I want to be when I grow up. So when I'm teaching my gifted high cap kids, and I think about you sometimes, I watch you in the classroom. I'm like, man, she is so sensitive to what's going on with your students in your classroom and knowing how to approach each one. You're constantly adapting to them all the time. And I don't even think you realize you're doing it.
I honestly, I have a ridiculously amazing life. Like, I do. I am so incredibly lucky, and things could have gone such a different direction.
Yeah.
I've had two adults in my life one when I was an 8th grader and one when I was 16. And they truly are probably why I'm alive. We know through research, like it takes one adult that a kid really goes, oh, they've got me. And if we all get to be that one person, then like the generational exponential effect of like, if we help one kid get to be them and be productive and be able to support themselves and a safe citizen and all the things that go along with that, I mean, it becomes infinite.
That was our conversation with Laura Schonberg, a powerful reminder that education is never one size fits all. Whether she was sharing stories of learners under the desk, profoundly gifted twins, or the importance of feeling safe enough to learn, Laura showed us how empathy and adaptability shape true connection. We hope her reflections inspire you to see your own learners, whether they are children, students, or even yourself, with fresh eyes and deeper compassion. Thanks for listening to Spiral We Radio, where we keep exploring how adaptive spirals connect us all.